start now. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending where you are right now. Welcome to this conference. I'm Khoi Nguyen. I'm managing editor at the U.S. Vietnam Review, a journal affiliated with the U.S. Vietnam Research Center at the University of Oregon. This is my great honor to share this event and introduce our esteemed speakers. I'm very happy to see Bill Hayton and Lan Nguyen here today for what promises to be fascinating presentations and thought-provoking conversation. Dear Bill Hayton and Lan Nguyen, thank you all for accepting our invitation and helping us to conduct this Zoom conference about the South China Sea dispute. After 5 years of the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in 2016. And before starting, I would like to express my regret that Dr. Derek Grossman at the Rand Corporation in Washington, D.C. cannot make today's conference. However, Derek will help us by answering our interviewing questions about the South China Sea dispute that we will publish on the website of the Vietnam US Vietnam Research Center. I will send this interview to both of you later. Virtually, let's be introduced to resource speaker Bill Hayton and Lan Nguyen. Bill Hayton was appointed as the Associate Fellow at the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House in 2015 and has worked as a journalist with BBC News since 1998. And he was BBC's reporter in Vietnam in 26 and 27 and spent a year seconded to the state broadcaster in Myanmar in 2013 and 2014, working on media development. And his focus is on South China Sea disputes and current affairs in Southeast Asia. Bill Hayton is the author of 3 books on Asia, the invention of China, published in 2020, the South China Sea, the struggle for power in Asia, published in 2014, and Vietnam, Rising Dragon, published in 2010, and the second edition published in 2020. These 3 books published by the Yale University Press. And Lan Nguyen is an assistant professor in public international law at the Department International and European Law at Utrecht University, Netherlands. Lan holds BA in International Relations from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and her PhD at the University of Cambridge, a monograph based on her thesis, the contribution of UNCLOS dispute settlement bodies to the development of the law of the sea will be published with Cambridge University Press next year. Plan's research interests lines public international law, the law of the sea, settlement of international dispute, the management and resolution of the maritime dispute in Asia. She's member of the Utrecht Center of Water, Ocean, and Sustainability Law. And she also an associate researcher of the Netherlands Institute for the Law of the Sea. Our 2 panelists will take turns to present this remark, and we will invite everyone to address your questions and comment to the presenters using the chat window, the chat box. By the way, I also sent our conference information to some academic forum, and some scholars sent us some questions in advance. I will send the questions to the speaker after their presentations. So Lan Nguyen will start our conference. In this conference, Lan Nguyen presentation left out of court and laughing at the court, the use of judicial measures in the South China Sea dispute will examine the role, the benefit, and the limitation of the international court in resolving the South China Sea dispute. So, Lan Nguyen, please go ahead.
Yep, someone has to be muted, unmuted. Well, good morning, good afternoon from the Netherlands. Thank you very much, Khoi, for the very kind introduction, as well as the kind invitation to present at the webinar today. So as Khoi has mentioned, my presentation today will focus on the use of judicial measures in the South China Sea disputes. And if I could just very quickly share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see the slides? Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, so what I'd like to do is basically to just focus on or use the South China Sea arbitration in 2016 as a point to reflect on the benefits and, as Khoi said, the limitations of the use of international courts and tribunals to settle the South China Sea disputes. So I'd like to start first with this image, which I think we are all familiar with to a certain extent. So this is a picture of the proceedings of the South China Sea dispute in 2000 that was initiated by the Philippines in 2013. So as you can see here, the case it was brought before an arbitral tribunal under Annex 7 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. So this means that this was brought before a tribunal of 5 members, as you can see them sitting here, all 5 men. It's an ad hoc tribunal, meaning that it was set up only to hear the South China Sea disputes, and then afterwards it was dissolved. And so on the left hand here, you can see the delegation of the Philippines. And then on the right hand here, as depicted by this empty table and empty chairs, which is where the respondent state normally sits, that China that did not participate in the proceedings. So China announced from the very beginning that it would not appear before the court to present its argument. It did not appoint any arbitrators. And after the awards were rendered, it also continued to announce that it would not accept the ruling of the arbitral tribunal, and it would not comply with the arbitral award. So this is what some observers have called the free nose policy of China. No participation, no acceptance, and no implementation. However, the fact that China did not appear before the arbitral panel did not stop the tribunal from going forward with the case. And indeed, the arbitral tribunal still considered the submissions put forward by the Philippines. And I think in order to understand the significance of the award, then we need to perhaps take a step back and quickly remind ourselves of what the arbitral award actually talked about and what it did not talk about. So the Philippines brought before the tribunal 15 points, 15 submissions, and these 15 submissions could be categorized or grouped into 3 main issues. And the first one is the one that concerns historic rights and the notorious or infamous 9-dash line that China has put forward to claim the South China Sea, as you can see here on the map. So this was the map that was attached to China's note verbal that is submitted to the UN in 2009. The second group of issues that the Philippines asked the tribunal to examine related to the legal status of features in the South China Sea. So basically, the Philippines asked the tribunal to determine whether certain features in the Spratly Islands are islands, rocks, or low tide elevations. And each of these category means that they will be entitled to, they will determine whether or and to what extent they will be entitled to maritime zones around them. And then the rest of the claims that were brought by the Philippines related to the Chinese actions in the South China Sea, for example, the building of artificial islands, illegal fishing, interference with navigation, for example. So the Philippines asked the tribunal to declare that China violated the convention through these actions. And the tribunal actually delivered two awards. One award in October 2015, in which it confirmed that it had the jurisdiction to hear the dispute. And then the second award in July 2016, which I think is the one that we're talking about or we're celebrating, in which it dealt with the submissions of the Philippines. And in essence, the tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines in almost all of these submissions. So the tribunal ruled that China does not enjoy historic rights that would go beyond what the convention had granted coastal states. It held that the 9-dash line was in violation of the Law of the Sea Convention. It held that all of the features in the Spratly Islands were either rock or low tide elevation and not islands, which means that they were not entitled to maritime zones, or if they were, they would only be entitled to a narrow band of water called the Territorial Sea around them of 12 nautical mile. And then the arbitral tribunal also found that China had violated international law of the sea through various measures, such as endorsing illegal fishing, interfering with navigation, aggravation of dispute. So in short, it was, I think the arbitral could be considered to have been a sweeping victory for the Philippines. However, we all know that the South China Sea dispute is a dispute with multiple layers, and the Philippines submissions obviously did not touch upon all of these layers. So there are certain issues in the South China Sea disputes that were not addressed by the arbitral tribunal. And perhaps the most noticeable one is the dispute concerning territorial sovereignty, which means that the Philippines did not ask the tribunal to decide who owns which islands in the South, or which features in the South China Sea. And the tribunal also did not address this. Now, the reason for this is that the tribunal, the arbitral tribunal, is a body that was set up by the Law of the Sea Convention. Therefore, the competence of the tribunal is not unlimited. It only has the power to deal with issues that are regulated by the Law of the Sea. And territorial sovereignty, so who owns land or islands, is not a matter that's regulated by the Law of the Sea. Therefore, it falls beyond the scope of competence of the tribunal. There are other issues that the tribunal also did not address. For example, maritime delimitation. So this is when maritime zones of states overlap, and therefore there's a need to draw a maritime boundary. And this was not an issue that the Philippines brought before the tribunal, nor did the tribunal address it. The tribunal also said that it did not have the jurisdiction to deal with military activities. And the reason why the tribunal did not deal with maritime delimitation or with military activities is because these are the types of disputes that have been excluded from the jurisdiction of the tribunal because China made a declaration in 2006 declaring that they exclude these disputes from the jurisdiction of the tribunal. So a quick revisit of the arbitral tribunal award tells us a few things about the arbitral award. So it did manage to set the record straight on several important yet ambiguous until then issues. For example, the issue of the illegality of the 9-dash line. It also clarified that that China or any other claimant states in the South China Sea, for that matter, cannot claim vast maritime zones based on the features in the Spratly Islands. But the arbitration itself was not, and I do not believe that it was intended to be the panacea for the South China Sea disputes. It did not deal with all the disputes in the South China Sea. So then, what happened afterwards? How significant, or what is the impact of the arbitral award? Well, I think the answer depends on who you are asking. Now, if we start with the parties to the dispute, the Philippines first, we see that there's been ups and downs in the way that the Philippines government and particularly the Duterte administration have viewed the arbitral award. So after the award was rendered, initially the Philippines welcomed the award, saying that this was a milestone decision. And then a few months later, President Duterte then just said that, well, this is just a piece of paper that can take a back seat in bilateral negotiations. Last year in 2020, before the UN General Assembly, he then he said that the arbitral award is now part of international law. It cannot be abandoned by state, only to turn around in May this year to say that, well, I could throw it in the waste bin. And then on the 5th anniversary of the arbitral award, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines then called the arbitral award a North Star that will guide the present and the future. So there's been quite some ups and downs in the way that the arbitral award has been received by the Philippines government. And then because of the inconsistent and somewhat watered down reception of the arbitral award, some observers have said that the arbitral award did not gain the impact that it could have had had it been received in a more enthusiastic manner by the winning party itself in this case. What about China? We already mentioned that China adopts this free nose policy, no participation, no acceptance, no implementation. So it seems easy then to say, well, that means that the award had no impact on China's behavior. And indeed, China, and including the Chinese government and Chinese scholars, persistently denounced the award as well as criticize and delegitimize the arbitral tribunal and its findings. And then on the field, we can see that China continues to have to take very assertive, very aggressive measures. So some examples, as you can see, this is a picture of the Chinese boats in the Whitsun Reef recently. China also sends survey ships escorted by Coast Guard and paramilitia boats to harass exploitation activities in the respective EEZ of Malaysia and Vietnam. And then earlier this year, China passed the Chinese Coast Guard law, which use very vague terms allowing a series of measures in waters that are called under the jurisdiction of China. So all of these measures then point to the fact that, well, nothing's really changed on the part of China post award. But there are several reasons that can explain this reality. And when it comes to international courts and tribunal, it is very, I think the way that states behave, and especially the parties to the case behave after the arbitral award, is quite telling of the nature of international courts and tribunals, as well as the nature of international law. As I already mentioned, international courts and tribunals, they do not have unlimited power. Their power to decide on matters depend on the issues that states or countries bring towards them. And even then, there are still limitations in the matters that they can consider. So in the South China Sea dispute, for example, I already mentioned that even one of the thorniest issues, which is territorial sovereignty, would be out of bounds from the jurisdiction of the court or tribunal in question. And since the question of who owns which island is still left open, this enabled China as well as other claimant states to continue to make divergent claims to territorial title over these different features in the South China Sea. And for China, this enables it to continue to make claims not only over sovereignty, but also all the waters that generate from those features. The second aspect of, or the second reason, or the second feature of international law is that it lacks an enforcement mechanism. It lacks a police force, so to speak, that you would see normally in domestic law. And therefore, compliance is dependent on good faith, on goodwill of the states, which means that this might be prone to power play. Now, that is not to say that international rulings are uh, uh, normally disregarded. The majority of international courts and tribunals' decisions are complied with. However, in the few cases that they have not, they've mostly involved um, great powers such as the US or China. So I do not think this is a coincidence. Well, even though China is insistent on ignoring the ruling, one, however, does note some slight changes, not if not in the way it behaves, in the way it formulates its claim in the South China Sea. So this you can see, for example, in the way that it lays out its claim in the note verbals that are submitted to the to the United Nations. So in 2009, this is the perhaps the notorious or the famous note verbal that set out the map of the 9-line that we saw earlier. And in this note verbal, China claimed to have sovereignty over the islands and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters as well as the seabed and subsoil. So this was the introduction of the 9-line. In 2011, however, the wording, the language of enjoying jurisdiction and sovereign rights in relevant waters and seabed and subsoil are not found in this note verbal that was submitted. Instead, China then focused here on China's Nansha Islands, which is the Spratly Islands, and it claims that Nansha Islands has it's entitled to all maritime zones, including territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, and continental shelf. Now, this, of course, was later in 2016 debunked by the Arbitral Tribunal, as I said earlier, where the tribunal said that the Spratly Islands are all either rocks or low tide elevations. And then in a more recent note verbal in 2019, then you see that the mention of the 9-line or of Nansha Islands being entitled to all maritime zones dropped. Instead, China then moved towards the rhetoric of the Nanhai Trudao, having which consists of 4 groups of islands in the South China Sea, having maritime zones, and that it has historic rights in the South China Sea. Now, of course, in line with its policy of deliberate ambiguity, these note verbals do not shed a whole lot of light on the legal basis for China's claim. But one could say that the move away from explicitly claiming maritime zones based on the Spratly Islands is conspicuous in light of the arbitral awards that I mentioned earlier. That is not to say, however, that China is now complying with international law. The note verbals, especially the 2019 note verbal, may be deemed to suggest a move away from this approach of zero legal content, meaning that complete defiance of the arbitral award, into some sort of legal basis. However, the 2019 note verbal and China's policy in general now speaks to, I think, a much more worrying issue or problem, which is that China is seeking to unilaterally reinterpret and redefine international law in a way that serves its purpose. So, for example, in the 2019 note verbal, we see that China still claims historic rights. And then the Chinese government, especially Chinese scholars, have said that these historic rights exist in customary international law, which that is unwritten law beyond the convention. And the tribunal did not properly take account of these historic rights of China. But the way that China and the Chinese scholars have interpreted historic rights are, of course, not in compliance with international law. And I think Bill has a very interesting article about the origin of this historic rights, pointing to the 1990s. So I highly recommend that article. And then the argument based on the 4 groups of islands, the Paracels Island, the Pratas, and these groups of islands, China seemed to claim as one. And it's not really clear what is meant by that, but one interpretation which has been advocated rather strongly by Chinese scholars over the past years is that they could be considered as one group of islands constituting an archipelago from which baselines could be drawn to claim vast maritime waters. Now, this sort of interpretation is again completely at odds with the Law of the Sea Convention. And so you can see that the way that what China is trying to do in here is to feign this sort of appearance as relying on international law, but it is a very distorted interpretation of international law. So if we look at the way that the parties have behaved, so the picture is quite grim. The takeaway message is that, you know, China is still consistently implementing its free node approach to the award. However, if we zoom out from the two parties to the dispute and the way they have behaved, and we take a broader perspective, perhaps all is not lost on a very optimistic note here. So we have seen in the past few years a trend in which states in the region, as well as states around the world, rallying behind the arbitral award and pointing directly to the arbitral award as an authoritative interpretation of UNCLOS, as setting up the framework for the conduct of parties, and to rely on the arbitral award to call out China for its wrong or its illegal behavior. So some examples you see, this is the note verbal by the United States, where it points directly to the tribunal in 2 paragraphs. This is the note verbal by France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And similarly, you see the reference to the arbitral award to support their arguments. This is one by Japan. Again, the arbitral award is mentioned. This is the other one by Indonesia. So I think this sort of reaction by states in the region and states around the world is important to mention, because it really helps to understand the impact of international decisions. So legally speaking, the arbitral award is only binding on the Philippines and China, so the parties to the case. However, I think if we only focus on the legal bindingness of the arbitral award, or if we only focus on whether or not the parties is complying with the arbitral award in the immediate aftermath of the arbitration, then we do not fully capture the significance or the value of the award. Just as if we focus on power play, we risk understating the role of international law. The award has a broader significance in the sense that it clarifies the law. It clarifies what the law is. It clarifies the rights and the obligations of states and what sort of conduct is expected from state. So, for example, by declaring that the 9-dash line is illegal and is by saying that the features in the spread lease are not entitled to vast maritime zones, then the arbitral award has helped for states to identify that there are no potential of overlapping maritime zones stemming from these features. The only legitimate claims are the ones from the coastline of the landmass. And so therefore it helps to identify disputed and non-disputed area. It helps then for states in the region to go about their business in a legal manner. And by clarifying all these issues, then it helps to distinguish between what conduct could be considered as legal and which conduct is illegal. So in a way, the arbitral award exerts what we call as a compliance pull towards states, or the legitimacy effect of international decisions. And international law, which is upheld by the award and which is clarified in the award, then structures the practice of state, and then it shines a light on which conduct is right and which conduct is wrong. Now, what we see from the behavior of China is that it rejects the arbitral award, but it always seeks to justify itself as complying with international law. In other words, it does not dismiss the importance of international law. But at the same time, as we saw earlier, it is constantly seeking to rewrite international law. So the arbitral award is there to remind all states to not be swept or deceived by this unilateral interpretation, and to provide a framework from which states can raise their voice to object against this reinterpretation of international law. So at the moment, I think we can perhaps conclude that the award does not have the compliance pool that perhaps we would want to see on China. But I think it remains to be seen whether in the long term, with the efforts of the claimant states and with the support of the wider international community, something might be changed. The present might be a bit pessimistic, but there are certain precedents involving other powerful states that might give us a glimpse of hope for the future. And so with that, I will conclude my presentation here, and thank you very much for your kind attention so far.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lan Nguyen, for your so informative and profound presentation. Bill Hayton is our next and also the concluding speaker. His presentation, resolving the territorial dispute in the South China Sea, compromise and its challenges, will present a methodology for resolving the South China Sea problems from the perspective of territorial sovereignty dispute. Over to you, Hayton.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And I was very pleased to listen to Lan's presentation, because the two of our talks work quite nicely together. Because I will be talking about the territorial disputes, and she quite nicely left a bit of that open for me. But also, I suppose there's a sort of some similarity, the idea that these things can be resolved. There is a possibility of progress moving forwards, in theory, at least anyway. I too have a few slides to show you, so I will bring them up now. Hope you can see those. Can you give me a thumbs up, Lan, if you can see that? Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk, as I said, about the territorial side. And as Lan opened, I think I'll echo her that there are layers of disputes. You have the geopolitical disputes, US, China, China, Japan. You have resource conflicts between China and its neighbors in the Southeast Asia. But underlying them all, you have territorial disputes. If it wasn't, I mean, if the South China Sea was like the North Sea without any islands, you could simply draw lines and claim exclusive economic zones. But it's the fact that these islands exist, even though they're tiny, which creates all the other problems, I would argue. But international courts have found ways to resolve arguments over islands, even islands that are very, very close together. So you may be aware of the case that Malaysia and Singapore fought at the International Court of Justice over the island, little rock thing in the foreground there called Pedra Branca, and another one, sort of those middle rocks that you can see in the distance. And these two features are, about a mile away from each other. They're not very far at all, as you can see from the picture. And the ICJ was able to rule that basically because Singapore had built a lighthouse on this rock and administered it, occupied it over a long period of time, that it had a stronger claim to jurisdiction, to sovereignty. Whereas middle rocks in the distance there, Malaysia, through long period of time, had asserted ownership, even if it hadn't done very much in terms of actually administering it. I think since then, the Malaysians have built their own lighthouse or facilities on middle rocks just to prove that they are in continuous occupation. So the point is that you can sort out territorial disputes over islands and rocks, even if they're very close to each other. And I would argue that this is really important because the territorial disputes are a permanent cause of instability. That all of the countries around the South China Sea are concerned about other countries taking their claims, taking their possessions. This makes them nervous and creates the possibility of conflict. I also think that the way that a lot of people look at the Chinese claims in particular, that somehow they are more historical than anybody else's claims, that tends to distort perspectives and policy. So, and we're concerned about whether China intends to build on the Scarborough Shoal, for example, to create sort of a triangle of control in the South China Sea. Then the arguments about territorial ownership there are a key foundation of China's policy here. But why does China wish to occupy all the other features? It's in a very strong position with its 7 large bases in the Spratlys. I think there's a nationalistic logic behind it, that if it believes that every single feature is rightfully Chinese, then that motivates it to continue to press to return, in quotes, every single feature in the South China Sea to China, and potentially even extend the claim to underwater features as well. We've seen some attempts to talk about underwater features as being part of China. Now, this kind of echoes slightly what Lan was talking about, these note verbals to the UN Commissions on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. This was the map, 2009, and then, as she pointed out, the language changed in 2011. And you can see where the most recent clashes have been marked on this map. They're all at the edge of the U-shaped line, on the Reed Bank here, close to the Philippines, on the Luconia Shoals, James Shoal area down here near Malaysian Borneo, and then on the Vanguard Bank, closer to Vietnam. How did these been? And actually, you can see that this is where the Chinese survey ships were active a couple of years ago as a kind of punishment to Vietnam for attempting to develop the oil and gas resources here. And you can see from the tracks, I don't claim these are absolutely scientifically accurate. I've basically taken 2 sets of maps and tried to overlay them on top of one another, but they're approximate. And they kind of show, I think, quite clearly here that China is regarding the U-shaped line, the 9-dash line here, as some kind of boundary, because it doesn't seem to go over the edge of it in these surveys. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why China kind of claims these underwater areas, and I'm going to argue that it's a mistake. And this is the most obvious mistake. This is officially the southernmost point of Chinese territory. It's known in Chinese as the Zhengmu Ansha, in English the James Shoal. And the point is that there's no territory there. It's an underwater feature. It's a mistake. How did we get into this? Well, we go back to the Republic of China's map of 1948. This map was drawn formally in December 1947, and no official line, was published. So no official reasoning was published. But Chris Chung, a PhD student at the University of Toronto, he has shown, I think, quite comprehensively by looking at Chinese documents from 1946 and 47, that it was only ever intended to be a line that just indicated which islands were being claimed. There was nothing at all about rights to waters, historic rights, or anything like that. It was simply to say, we claim these features and we don't claim, for example, Natuna Island here. And this line, going back, this was drawn by 2 geographers who were both seconded to the Ministry of the Interior to advise the Chinese government in the wake of the Second World War which features should be claimed. And they themselves got their ideas. That's right. So one of them, Zheng Ziyu, went on the actual expedition to Ituaba in December of 1946. Here's a picture of them here. And where do these people get their ideas from? Well, they were both students of a geography professor called Bai Mei Chu, who taught them at Beijing Normal University in the 1930s. And Bai Mei Chu was the author of an atlas, the New Atlas of China's Construction, which he published privately as an individual. He's not a government official. He was just a guy who was a nationalist who wanted to educate his people and tell them all about the Chinese territorial claims on land and on sea. And he drew this map, which was published in his atlas in 1936. But this map was a very, very bad map when it came to the South China Sea. There's a whole series of non-existent islands marked on this map. So You'll see down here, the James Shoal is marked as an island. Over here, the Vanguard Bank, and over here, Seahorse Bank. And the Chinese names, Chanwei Tan is simply a translation of the English name Vanguard Bank. James Shoal, Zhengmu is JM for Zhengmu Tan. Seahorse, Haima is the Chinese word for a seahorse. These islands here simply don't exist. This one I think is the Scarborough Shoal over here, it's supposed to be. So basically he invented a whole load of non-existent islands, drew a line around them, and you see the point of this line goes all the way to the southwest, down to the south and out to the east here, in order to include these non-existent islands. I think that's very important, because that's exactly where these clashes are taking place now, in the same place as these non-existent islands. So if the line hadn't been drawn to go around these non-existent islands, then we wouldn't be in the position now of having these clashes. And where did he get these non-existent islands from? Well, I can't prove it, but it seems to me very striking that when you look at a map like this, a British map published in London in 1918, you can see, for example, here's the Vanguard Bank marked with a dotted line. So it's an underwater feature. Here's the James Shoal, also marked with a dotted line. Here's Seahorse Bank with a dotted line. It seems to me that Bai Mei-chu simply copied this map and turned these dotted lines into solid lines and invented the idea that these were actually proper islands. And I think this is the reason why the U-shaped line takes the form that it does, because Bai Mei-chu copied this British map without really understanding what it was. In the process, he used the names which the Chinese government committee had drawn up in the 1930s, 1934 and 35, and they'd used the words tan as the translation for shoal and bank. But shoal is an old English word, not really used today, which means shallow, not an island. And tan is a Chinese word that means a sandbank, which could be either above water or below water. So they turned the underwater feature into an above water feature. And we can see that China's government's claim changed rather radically under the influence of these two geography professors that I mentioned before, who had been trained by Bai Mei-chu. So, and we can tell this from two editions of the same book, which were published by the Chinese Ministry of Information. One in 1943, and then a second edition 4 years later in 1947. So these are government books. You can find them in the British Library and in the SOAS Library in London, and that's why I found them and took these pictures. So in the first edition in July 1943, the first page talks about the territory of China, and it says that China's territory extends as far south as the Paracel Islands, the Huangsha, the Xisha, in the northern part of the South China Sea, obviously. But by the time you get to the second edition of the book, published in 1947, you'll see that there's a much longer paragraph about the territory, and it talks about the sovereignty going as far south as the Tuansha Islands. Now, the Tuansha was what the Chinese used to call the Spratlys. They now call them the Nansha, but at the time they were known as the Tuansha. So between 1943 and 1947, the territory shifted, or the territorial claim shifted 600 miles south to include the Spratly Islands, the Nansha, as they are now known in Chinese. And then China has marshaled all kinds of historical evidence to try to convince audiences that this claim is ancient and goes back thousands of years. And here is a statement from the Chinese white paper in the year 2000, which is still on the Foreign Ministry's website. And it talks about an old document, the Yiwuji. And a quote here: there are islets, sand keys, reefs, and banks in the South China Sea. Water is shallow and filled with magnetic rocks. Now, this is put forward as an assertion that Chinese people knew these areas intimately, and that there was Chinese state control in effect of these areas going back 2,000 years or so. However, if you actually go back and try and find the Yiwuji, well, the first thing is to say that the Yiwuji doesn't exist, because what we have now are copies of copies of copies. The original is long gone. But when you look at it, you see there's no mention of the South China Sea whatsoever. It just talks about the sea. And so it's not clear which part of the sea this is in. And then there's a second sentence, which is that foreigners reinforce their ships with metal. And so what the suggestion here, of course, is that it was actually the foreigners, it was the Malay, the Indians, the Arabs, the Persians, who were traveling across the South China Sea, who provided this information, people from Southeast Asia and South Asia. And this information was then recorded by people on land. So my argument here is just to show you that the assertion of the strong historical claim to all the features based on thousands of years of historical knowledge and so forth is, in my view, is very weak. And each piece can be chipped away. Problem is, it takes quite a long time to do so. By contrast, I would say Southeast Asian states are very poor at presenting their own maritime history. And I think there's reasons for that. I think, for example, in Vietnam, a lot of the maritime history involves the Sham people, people of Champa. It's not part of the Viet, the King history of Vietnam. In other countries, in the Philippines, it's pre-Christian. In Indonesia and Malaysia, it's pre-Muslim, a lot of it. And so therefore it hasn't been part of the kind of the mainstream narrative. And I think all of these countries need to look into their past more and make use of the sort of aspects of the history which have become marginalized in terms of the telling the national story. I think it would help them understand the history of the South China Sea much, much better. Now, this is why I think is where we get to the possibility of moving forward. At the moment, pretty much all of the country, well, the major claimants, so China, brackets Taiwan too, Vietnam, and the Philippines to some extent, all talk about their territorial claims in the South China Sea as a collective claim. So China talks about claims, as we were just hearing from Lan, to the Nanhai Judao, the South Sea archipelago, and which they link four. So Dongsha, meaning Pratas Island, up towards Taiwan, Xisha, the Paracels, the Zhongsha in the middle of the sea, and the Nansha down in the south. Now, one thing that's important to understand there is that the Zhongsha, the central sands, don't actually exist. There's Scarborough Shoal, and the rest of it's all underwater. The reason that Chinese officials talk about the Zhongsha, the central sands, as an archipelago is basically because they're still relying on the bad map drawn by Bai Mei-chu in the 1930s, in which he invented those non-existent islands in the middle of the South China Sea. So that's why China still talks about four archipelagos, even though there are really only two archipelagos, the Paracels and the Spratlys, and then two isolated features, Scarborough Shoal and Pratas or Dongsha. So China talks about claiming all the groups. Vietnam also talks about the Hoang Sa and the Chuang Sa, claiming all of the features collectively. The Philippines talks about the Calayan Island group, which is basically the whole of the Spratlys, with the exception of Spratly Island itself. And the reason is because back in the 1940s, they came to understand that the French, at the time, the colonial power in Indochina, had claimed Spratly Island. So they kind of took a bit out of their claim to allow the French to have that, and they could claim the rest. Malaysia has very specific claims to 5 features, Brunei just to 1. But the point is, by trying to work out who has the best claim to all of the features, you make it very difficult to resolve, because how can you claim that any state occupied all of them through time? I think a much better way is to disaggregate the claims, is to break up the claims and talk about claims to specific features. And so what I think is a way forward, and this could be done with the assistance of governments, but it doesn't actually require the assistance of governments. What we really want to do is create a kind of matrix, and this is a very simple idea or version of it here. Name each individual feature, look at the potential claimants and look at what information those claimants have put forward as to why they are the rightful owner of each individual feature. When did they first plant their flag there? Did they maintain their claim, their occupation? What have they done since they put their flag in the ground, or whatever it might be? And I think when you start to do it like this, it sort of becomes easier to resolve, because, for example, I think you could claim that the Republic of China / Taiwan has occupied Ituaba, Taiping Dao, fairly continuously since the Second World War. The Philippines has occupied Titu, known in the Philippines as Pagasa. Vietnam has occupied Spratly Island, Chuang Sa Lun, and Malaysia has occupied Swallow Reef too. And once you start to break it up, you then realize that actually there's the grounds here for a compromise if all the sides are willing to make a compromise. I think this could be done as a kind of public process. You could kind of lay out the information, you could present it to international audiences, you could invite comments, you could ask for counter evidence or whatever. And as long as it's provided, with a sort of empirical base, photographs, other evidence of occupations and that kind of thing. It might even be possible that you could sort of have an unofficial International Court of Justice type event where the various claimants, or people acting on behalf of the various claimants, kind of put forward their arguments, and judges, for want of a better word, experienced arbitrators could rule on it, and thereby present a solution to the various claimants. My argument then is, once you start to look at this, is that with very few exceptions, the pattern of occupation that you see today is the only one that's ever existed. And there are obviously some exceptions to this. The most obvious one is that, as this picture shows, the Chinese occupied and captured by force the western half of the Paracel Islands in 1974. A year later, 75, Vietnam took Southwest Key from the Philippines. But those are really the only two examples where we've seen a change of control, a forcible change of control that I'm aware of. I'm happy to be corrected if anybody thinks I've missed one out. So in effect, what we have now, in terms of Vietnam occupying more than half of the Spratly Islands, for example, is by and large, it's the only pattern of occupation that has ever existed in the South China Sea. We don't need to kind of go back into, centuries ago to see some happy time when every single feature was occupied by different powers. So therefore, I think it is relatively easy to see the basis of a compromise. And I think this is really important, because once you start to take out the underwater features from the equation, from the claims to the James Shoal, the Xingwu Anshadan in the south, to Vanguard Bank, to Seahorse Shoal over here, then instead of this 9-dash line over here being the point of contention, you could start to draw a line around the actual islands here. And basically, you could find some working solution here, some kind of compromise where the waters in the middle are cooperatively managed. But you take out these areas on the extreme edge of the 9-dash line, which is where all the conflict is. So it'd be a major step, I think, towards deconflicting the contesting claims in the waters. And then within these areas, you can start to recognize the status quo. This doesn't have to be done kind of legally and overtly, but it could be the basis for a sort of confidence building measure, a kind of working compromise whilst relations are repaired. So, I think there's nothing special, sacred or historic about any country's claims in the South China Sea. China certainly don't go back before 1909 in the case of the Paracels, 1946 in the case of the Spratlys. Vietnam claims occupation going back to the early 19th century with the Nguyen dynasty, Emperor Zhalong in 1816 or so. But it'd be interesting to kind of look in more detail about exactly which features were occupied back then. I mean, I don't think it was every single feature. I don't think it was, for example, the eastern end of the Sprat. These are certainly not Scarborough Shoal, for example. But let's bring that out into the open. And therefore, I think maintaining a claim to the other unoccupied features or the features occupied by other countries is a problem, because it just heightens the insecurity. And the solution really is this Latin phrase, uti possidetis ita possideatis. As you currently possess, so you shall possess in the future. Basically, you keep what you occupy now, and you quietly drop your claims to the other bits. It's a controversial position, and obviously it requires major de-escalation of tension, but I think it would also help to alleviate some of the stress and the risk of conflict in the South China Sea. So, and my rallying cry: get to the archives and see if we can work this one out. But I'm happy to take questions and your comments and thoughts. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bill Hayton, for your so profound, wonderful presentation. So we have completed the presentations of the two speakers, and big thanks to each of our speakers for their engaging presentation. Now, I'd like to open it up to audience now. We come to the idea exchange and Q&A section. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and I will direct your questions one by one to the speakers. Yeah, while we are waiting for an audience question to come in, I myself have questions about a question that I would love our presenter to speak to, and I also have some questions sent to our conference in advance, so I also forward them to speaker right now. Yes, I have questions for you, Hayton. You know, I remember that maybe 2 years ago in 2018 at an annual conference about the South China Sea dispute.
Close the door for 1 second.
Yeah.
I'm back.
Yeah. I remember that in 2018 at the annual conference about the South China Sea dispute conducted at the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. You suggested that if China wants natural resources such as fish, so just buy it in the supermarket. It's much cheaper than building a huge artificial island on the South China Sea.
It's 16 hours.
Yeah, that's so humorous, and your humor present the cost and the benefit for China. So please tell me, is that right if I say that the cost that China has paid for the South China Sea, such as building huge artificial islands, is so big compared to the economic benefit? So if that is true, why did China choose that cost?
Good question, very good question. I don't think there's a one answer to this, but I think that the answer comes in different parts. And the reason that it did so, I think, is because all the different parts were kind of working in the same direction. So at the bottom, you have the nationalism, the territorial claim, the idea that this is a good thing for the country as a whole. And to understand that, you have to understand how the Communist Party in China has the idea of the century of humiliation and the resistance of the foreigners and getting back territory. That territory is quite important to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Hong Kong, Taiwan, all part of the same story. I think there's also a strong domestic lobby which could see that there was money to be made. I mean, just in the same way as building a motorway or a railway system, the government spends money and companies can get the contracts and they can make money themselves, and that provides jobs and all the rest of it. So the fact that the big construction companies could make some money, and that the Navy would get a bigger budget, and that Hainan province would be able to administer a local authority called Sansha, and that it would get a budget and prestige. That I think was also important. And then I think the third part of the story is something that we don't know enough about, which is how much China intends to use the deep areas of the South China Sea as a place to hide its nuclear missile submarines. And therefore, if it's going to try and keep everybody else out of the South China Sea during a time of crisis in order to protect its nuclear submarines, then it's going to need these big bases in order to keep out foreign navies. And that obviously also plays into any potential war game that might feature an invasion of Taiwan at some point in the future, which takes us back to the territorial question at the beginning. So yeah, I think, and obviously it also gives China some extra advantages in terms of having a surveillance network which is closer to the Malacca Strait, and they can spy on the neighboring countries. But China has obviously incurred a lot of costs, reputational costs. People are more suspicious of China now. But I suppose the question is whether it's actually had any kind of material costs in terms of, kind of, has China's prosperity been damaged? Have people in China suffered? And I guess the answer is probably not. That despite everybody being more hostile towards China and its ambitions, it hasn't really suffered any financial costs. I mean, I think it's been self-defeating for China, that China would have had a much better time if it had played these claims much more quietly and subtly and reached a compromise with its neighbors. But at the same time, it's hard to point to anything that they've actually lost by doing this.
Yes, thank you, Victor. I have a question sent. A question from Việt Hoàng from the Ho Chi Minh City University of Law. Yes, sent to Lan Nguyen. Yeah. Yes, there's a question to Lan. In 2019 and 2018, many experts predicted that Vietnam will follow the Philippines step to sue China in the part of arbitration. However, according to Professor Jonathan Oldham in his recent article, this these are the value and viability of the South China Sea arbitration ruling. According to Professor Jonathan Oldham, the countries like Vietnam needs to consider legal measures, because even if they win a lawsuit like Philippines, there is no mechanism to compel China to comply with the ruling. So according to you, if in the future China continues to harass Vietnam at sea, should Vietnam choose to sue in court as Philippines did, and why?
Yeah, thank you very much, Anviet, and for the questions. So I think that's probably the question that everyone would normally ask. So, what should other states in the region follow suit uh, and bring a case towards an international court or tribunal against China? Well, I think bringing a case to an international court and tribunal is never an easy task. There are a lot of factors that need to be weighed against one another, and those are not just legal factors. Um, so, indeed, in the past years, or in I think 2018, 2019, and more recently, we've heard talks about, even at the high level, where high level officials of the Vietnamese government saying that, judicial measures are not off the table. They've never explicitly said that we will sue, but we have not ruled out that possibility. So the talk is there. But of course, as we all say, you talk the talk, but do you walk the walk? Whether that actually becomes a measure that the Vietnamese government will take is still open to question. Um, I think the spirit of pursuing legal measures is there, but it's more to portray the image of Vietnam as not backing down. Whether that turns into actual measure, I personally, I do not see that in the, at least in the near future. And I do not pretend to venture into politics or political science. That's not really my area. But from a legal perspective, I also think that you should also ask yourself questions as, what are we going to sue on? So there are a lot of the issues that are now still pertinent that, as I said, was not dealt with by the tribunal. It is unlikely that Vietnam will be able to bring China against. So, for example, the issue of territorial sovereignty. So there have been a lot of talks in the public about, bringing China to an international court and ask the court to decide which is it China or is it the Vietnam that has sovereignty over islands in the Spratleys or in the Paracels. Now, the problem there is there might not be a court that would have competence to do that, because, as I said, the law of the sea tribunals, they cannot deal with territorial sovereignty issues. Now, you heard Bill mentioning territorial issues being brought before the International Court of Justice, for example, in the case between Singapore and Malaysia. And so the question has always been, why don't we go to the ICJ? Why don't we take China before the ICJ? But there's a huge hurdle there, which is that the ICJ can only hear the dispute if China agrees to that. And we all know that the attitude of China towards international courts and tribunals is a firm no. They've always insisted that everything has to be done via bilateral negotiation. So there are a lot of consideration: which court to go to, what kind of questions to ask. So territorial sovereignty is out of the table. The legal status of the features in the South China Sea. So the Spratly Islands, the South China Sea arbitration has already clarified. So there's no need to reopen that question again. And then again, the question, the what you pointed out, how to enforce the ruling if the ruling is handed down, as we already have the precedent of the South China Sea. And at the back of that, how does the government deal with the pressure from China, for example? So I think I can't speak for China, Vietnam, whether it should bring a legal dispute. From a more legal perspective, it's what to bring and where to bring it and what benefits can come from it. So only when those three questions could be answered, I think, where the question of should Vietnam follow suit can be answered. And whether or not they will do that in the coming years, my personal take on it is that it's unlikely. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Lan. Yeah. There's a question from Hang Pham from the Vietnam's National University at the Ho Chi Minh City State School. Yes, thank you so much for informative talk from our presenter. I would like to ask your thought on possibility of ASEAN. Yeah, he asked about ASEAN. Possibility of ASEAN role and the US in helping with problem, since nearly half of its members involved in the dispute. Yeah, maybe this question sent to both of you. Yes, Hayton.
Yeah, I mean, well, I would say maybe more than half, because Indonesia has a maritime dispute. Singapore as a maritime trading country is concerned. So the ones that aren't is really, you know, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, I guess. So it's kind of 6-4, really. But no, I'm skeptical, and I think this is partly to do with some of the regional politics. I mean, for example, under the previous Philippine president, Mr. Aquino, he was very keen on a sort of regional approach, encouraging ASEAN to stand together. But as soon as Mr. Duterte came in, he wanted to pursue a Philippines first policy, and he really, you know, damaged the collective solidarity of ASEAN on this question by going it alone. I think Vietnam would like an ASEAN approach, maybe some of the other claimant states as well, but it only takes one ASEAN country to disagree, and that makes everything impossible. And ASEAN has repeatedly shown that it's not willing to break into small groups, so that, for example, just the 6 most interested countries could work together. It always wants to work at 10, and that slows it down. And even when it comes to the China-ASEAN Code of Conduct, and obviously those talks involve China, so that makes them more difficult. But you don't have a kind of single ASEAN position. It's now, this month, I just wrote an article pointing out that it's 25 years this month since ASEAN foreign ministers first called for a code of conduct on the South China Sea. And 25 years later, we're still waiting for that code of conduct. So ASEAN is very good at organizing meetings for people to talk about the problems, but isn't really a means for settling them, partly because the different ASEAN states have different points of view, and also they can have a perception, I think, that they can force China to do something that China doesn't want to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Hayton. Thank you. In your presentation, Hayton, I have a question for Hayton. In your presentation, you and also in an article, that's published previously, the modern origin of China, South China Sea claim maps with understanding and maritime geobody. Yeah, in this article, you also point out that some Chinese scholars has published a lot of false documents and in international journals. And Nguyễn Thụy Anh, a fellow at the ISI Foundation, that's a research unity affiliated to the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, also point out that science journal has become a new front line in the South China Sea dispute. Some international scholars, due to their inability of access to Chinese document, so refer to these sources, and thus have made some mistake in documenting and assessing the South China Sea dispute. So, in your opinion, what scholar from countries like Vietnam, Philippines, and other international scholars should do to deal with this phenomena in academia?
Good question. Well, I think different scholars will have different skills. I mean, I think those with language and history skills can examine some of these documents that have been put forward from the Chinese side critically and see what's whether they can be supported by the actual evidence. Go back as far as you possibly can in the history. I mean, my own research, that paper you mentioned about the emergence of China's claim, that article. I mean, I was reading all of this material which had been written in the 1970s, but I realized it was all based on material that came from a series of newspaper articles in 1933. And so once I realized that, and realized that it wasn't ancient, that it was about how people were feeling in the context of a crisis in 1933, that really set the agenda for the Chinese claim. And it was then possible to critically examine some of that. So, you know, I think, I mean, China has the resources and the institutions like the universities to employ a lot of academics working on legal arguments of the kind that Lan was talking about, you know, to come up with new variations on their claim. So they invent the idea of the four shahs. They talk about groups of islands having exclusive economic zone entitlements. These are kind of being generated in places like Xiamen with their sort of, you know, University of Ocean Studies or whatever it might be. And there are, you know, 5 or 6, you know, departments or centers, you know, in China, you know, where you have concentrations of people developing new ideas to kind of avoid complying with UNCLOS and the arbitral tribunal. So you kind of, you know, need to keep an eye on what's coming out of these institutions and think about, you know, what your legal response is going to be, you know, or what your historical response is going to be, or whatever it may be. So yeah, kind of any, you know, the Southeast Asian side needs to, you know, be more active about its history, be more critical about the kind of the narratives that are put out there, and also kind of understand the international legal and political context as sharply as possible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. This is the there's no more questions, but I have a word to share with you, Hayton. I personally totally agree with your vision about the sparkly sovereignty dispute. You know, according to the award, the sparkly archipelago is not an archipelago. It's not a single unit. So countries are allowed, those claimed the sparkly as a whole, not single unit, have no legal basis, legal foundation for that. So Vietnam, China, and also Taiwan, Philippines, so those countries don't have. Yes, I think they should think again, consider again about their claim. They can claim some single unit inside the area, but they can't. They can claim sparkly as a whole. But I don't know how those countries can deal with the nationalism in domestic politics to speak out that spirit. And how do you think about that? Can countries like Vietnam and tell us now Trường Sa archipelago does not exist? Trường Sa archipelago just imagination. We have just only some single unit in that.
Yeah, I have no doubt that it would be a difficult process, and there might be a backlash, you know, a reaction from the public. But I do wonder whether it might be presented, you know, for example, if Vietnam and the Philippines were to recognize one another's possessions, even just temporarily, de facto, not de jure, that it would be a way of forming a connection, a partnership, something not quite an alliance, but a partnership, and could that then be extended to the other Southeast Asian, so I guess to Brunei and Malaysia. Obviously, the Philippines and Malaysia have their own sovereignty disputes about Sabah, and the eastern end of Borneo, which might complicate, Philippines and Malaysia recognizing things. But it'd be a way, I think, of pushing the agenda forward, and so that would allow them to then present a united front. I mean, I think the Southeast Asians have to actually, be realistic. Are they actually, is Vietnam serious about pushing the Philippines off any of the features that it currently holds? Is the Philippines serious about pushing Vietnam off any of the features it currently holds? I think the answer is obviously no. So therefore, why not make that, obvious on paper with some kind of de facto recognition, and then start from there, and that will then start to change the terms of the discussion.
If I could just add, well, obviously, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, territorial sovereignty dispute is always at the forefront of the South China Sea dispute. And indeed, that Vietnam does claim territorial sovereignty over all of the features, all the Rocky Islands in the South China Sea. But there's a difference between the claim of the Chinese claim and the Vietnamese claim when it comes to maritime zones. So Vietnam does not claim to group all of the islands in the Spratleys as a group of archipelago, and thereby drawing an archipelagic baseline to claim maritime zones from the whole group of islands. There's a difference there. So Vietnam recently has, in its, if I'm not mistaken, in its, I don't remember which one now, but where it actually clarified its stance regarding the legal status of the features in the Spratleys. And that clarification is very much in line with the arbitral award. So even though the claim to territorial sovereignty for the Spratly Islands between China and Vietnam is the same, which is that they claim all of the islands and the features in the Spratlys, there's a very big difference in the maritime claims between the two countries when it comes to the Spratlys. I just want to, just jump in and clarify that. And so I think because of the claims, because Vietnam is sort of now aligning itself in terms of the maritime claims to the arbitral tribunal, there is, as Bill say, it's a bit easier in terms of the potential to sort of, as Bill said, sort of dissect the disputes and really focus on what could be solved. So that's just my 2 cents. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your opinion and information. Yes, if there's no more questions, we can finish now. And thank Bill Hayton and Lan Nguyen again so much for your wonderful presentation and answering the questions. And thanks everyone for sharing your opinion and questions. Time has run out, and I would like to have some just some word conclude about today's event. We appreciate the 2 speakers, Hayton and Lan Nguyen, for your excellent analysis, knowledge, and vision. And thank you all for your participation. In his presentation, Bill Hayton outlined history of dispute and methodology for resolving the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. For Hayton, territorial claims to some tiny coral atoll rocks and reef by states around the South China Sea has underlined the contemporary disputes in this very important geopolitical water. And these territorial disputes among China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines are commonly regarded as irresolvable. But basing on Hayton presentation, we can think positively that it's not impossible thing if we base it on scientific objectivity, base it on the truth, the just, and peaceful pursuit spirit. And in her presentation, Lan Nguyen used the South China Sea Arbitral Award in 2016, and the subsequent responses to the award to reflect upon the use of international court in resolving the South China Sea dispute, and including the benefit can be gained from and the limitation adhering to resorting to the international judicial mechanism. As the two speakers, our territorial and legal dispute are at the center of this dangerous confrontation in the South China Sea, and this area is expected to be hotter in the near future. So we hope that we hope to be able to do more such seminar, conference like this with both of you in the future. Thank you. Thank you so much for participation.